Mike Figueredo has made the claim that Tomi Lahren and other right-wingers are clutching their pearls over Minneapolis uprising. I just figured that meant they were protecting their pearls from someone who might want to steal them. But what it really means is someone who's a prude or stuck up or conceited who is feigning outrage over something. And you see the traditional putting your hand over your chest going, so I guess these people who are feigning outrage over looting and property damage are pearl clutchers. I should have some pearls so I can do it properly.
For example, Tomi Lahren clutched her pearls at the looting, tweeting, "If you smash and bang on cop cars, riot and burn flags in the streets and loot your community businesses, you are not a protester. You are part of the problem. Is this really how you bring justice? Is this how you honor his life?"
So I guess that's pearl clutching. So I've been thinking about this because he says right-wingers. So I thought, well, is it right-wingers or left-wingers? Because we don't really have any left-wingers in this country. But what he's saying is that right-wingers are more likely to clutch their pearls. But I would say that neoliberals, who are right-wingers for sure, are the main ones to clutch their pearls as opposed to those in the Republican Party. Now, there are neoliberals in the Republican Party, lots of them. A lot of them are the suburban moms who turned out in droves and vote for Joe Biden instead of the Republican Party this time. But lifelong Democrats who are neoliberals, I would say are right-wingers, but I would say that they're still not thought of that way. So then, as I am wont to do, I started to think more about it, and my brain kept churning away, and then I wrote this article, DNC Neoliberal Entitlement, Not Traditional Conservatism, Killed George Floyd. I'll lay out the argument succinctly, point by point, so as not to get bogged down in superfluous prose. Therefore, please forgive the sometimes clunky transition between ideas. Systemic racism is materialistic. That is, this is mine, not yours, and thus is built on the bedrock foundation of property rights. The idea of individual ownership is the root of the problem. Our owners, in the way George Carlin describes them, are, of all of us, most inflicted with the scourge of entitlement. The watchdogs of our owners, law enforcement or military personnel, guard the owner's possessions from the riffraff. Money is not real. If the government can print its own money, why not George Floyd? I think he was accused of forging checks or some other form of embezzlement. So then I say, why not the rest of us? The fact that only the owners get to print money seems arbitrary. Who should decide who gets to print money? For whose benefit should money be printed? If your response to this question is, you loot, we shoot, then you are on the entitled side of the equation. It is undeniable that whoever prints the money owns everyone else. The idea that it is morally defensible to own property is no more self-evident than is the idea that it is morally defensible to possess animals or people. Who can say in this brief existence that anybody truly owns anything? Material decays, we decay, property changes hands. Why attach? Attachment is the root of suffering. There's enough for everyone. Why hoard? Why control? Why possess? Enough is a feast. Society's owners and their minions are control freaks. In general, how happy are people with controlling personalities? If you're an atheist, you can skip the next part, but you might find it instructive. What do scriptures say? The next few points only apply to those who ascribe to Abrahamic religious teachings, so feel free to skip ahead. How did Jesus feel about material possessions and ownership? From Matthew chapter 6, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. From the book of Luke, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And from earlier in that same chapter, and he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. What does the Quran say? The desire of increase in worldly possessions beguiles you till you reach the graves. Surely you will soon come to know the vanity of your pursuits. Again, you surely will soon come to know how mistaken you are. Only if you knew for certain, you would surely see hell in this very life, but you will see it with the certainty of sight in the life to come. Then you shall be called to account on that day in respect of the worldly favors conferred on you. I'm not an expert in the Quran, but I assume that means pretty much the same thing as Jesus said. Don't be greedy. Don't be stingy. You will be held accountable if you are. What does the Torah say about generosity to strangers, regardless of their merit? This is from Leviticus chapter 19. The stranger who sojourns with you shall be as a native from among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Are religious people true adherents of their faiths if they don't follow the example of the prophets and ascribe to their teachings about possessions and how to treat others? The possession of wealth leads the possessors to believe that their lives matter more than the lives of those who do not possess anything. But who is actually rich? I would say the happier people are richer than the miserable wealthy people. Now we're going to talk about the new right. Neoliberals and neoconservatives are both equally the new right and fundamentally agree on economics. And I differentiate them from traditional conservatives. And to the new right, I ask this question. Is our collective belief in the concepts of liberty and freedom, then, that freedom constitutes freedom from being bullied, or does it believe that freedom constitutes freedom to bully others? Some people want freedom to bully more than it seems that they want freedom from bullies. Perhaps they want both at the same time, in which case they're assholes. Conservatives believe in paternalism, the idea of a ruling class. Edmund Burke developed the idea of a natural aristocracy that described a class that is bred to rule because of their innate hereditary abilities, passed down from generation to generation. An example of this is Lord Salisbury, who was a member of the Cecil family, an aristocratic family. Traditional and one-nation conservatives believe that the wisdom to know best is inherent to leaders such as Salisbury and cannot be acquired through simple hard work. Instead, it is gained through generations of experience. So that's a traditional conservative. However, the neoliberal side of the new right take a different stance to the traditional and ONS conservatives. Neoliberals believe in the idea of a meritocracy, being given a chance on merit, contrary to the traditional and ONS conservative belief that the right to rule is an innate feature of being a part of an aristocratic family. New right leaders such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan embraced the rationalism of new right thinkers such as Ayn Rand, Robert Nozick, and Friedrich von Hayek, who believed that each individual was able to make the best decisions for themselves and rise up in society according to their own talents and abilities. The new right rejected the idea of a state ruled by a hereditary elite. Conservatives believe in the idea that Thomas Hobbes created in his book Leviathan. In the book, it explains that the state comes before society, as Hobbes believed that without order, there can be no freedom, and there could be no order without a set of clear, undisputed laws backed up by firm authority. He believed that the wisdom and experience of a ruling class confer natural authority because some know best and are born to rule. Some neoconservatives believe in the idea of the state upholding law and order. Robert Nozick, who believed in a minimal state, argued in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, the state should exist to uphold the protection of the rights of life, liberty, property, and contract. However, the idea of an authoritarian state advocated by traditional conservatives is strongly rejected by the new right. They cannot accept the restrictions on individual freedom that would come from such a restrictive state. So it's the new right that argues for small government and not necessarily the old right. Traditional and ONS conservatives both believe in a paternalistic state where those at the top have a duty to look after those at the lower end of society. Benjamin Disraeli reintroduced the idea of noblesse oblige, a term used in the feudal times to describe the duty a noble had to look after their peasants. Benjamin Disraeli believed the state had to be much more active in promoting the welfare of those at the bottom. Because of this, ONS conservatism expanded the role of the state between the 1860s to the 1970s, where they passed laws that improved working conditions and living conditions for the poorest in society. These are conservatives. ONS conservatives from the middle of the 20th century were prepared to expand the role of the state by accepting policies such as limited nationalization, higher taxes on the wealthy, and an expanded welfare state and NHS. That sounds like Dwight Eisenhower to me. This government intervention went well beyond the role that traditional conservatives envisaged for the state. The new right, who are ambitious usurpers of the old right, fundamentally reject paternalism because of their faith in individualism, as long as it benefits them personally. That's from the song Love Me, I'm a Liberal by Phil Oakes. They believe that self-help, individual responsibility, and personal action should be used, not a paternalistic fatherly approach. Welfare benefits supported by 20th century one-nation state ONS conservatives led to a dependency culture according to the neoliberal New Right. They believe that dependency on the state is morally wrong. It strips humans of dignity and independence. And yes, Democrats of the old school, they call themselves New Democrats. Bill Clinton and Joe Biden are New Democrats. Obama, albeit a little more stealthy, also is a New Democrat. Hillary Clinton absolutely is a New Democrat. And these are right-wingers, absolutely. And their legislation bears it out. They believe it is morally wrong, and it strips humans of dignity and independence to have them supported by the state. I believe that they object because it makes it more difficult to get the serfs to do their bidding. If you want a good example of a Democrat who is of this mind, just look at the legislative record of Joe Biden over the last 30 years or more, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Traditional conservatives believe that capitalism naturally leads to economic inequality, and they see that as a good thing, and sharpens the division between the rich and the poor. And they see that as a good thing, traditional conservatives, as well as putting great emphasis on the protection of private property. Burke and economist Adam Smith both strongly supported capitalism. However, capitalism is also fast-moving and prone to radical change. Traditional conservatives fear, for that reason, the unstable nature of capitalism and also the optimistic liberal belief that the free market is the solution to economic problems. I learned that fairly recently, that liberalism believes in the free market. And that's why Margaret Thatcher and Ronnie Reagan are neoliberals, because they believe in a free market. But traditional conservatives are more pessimistic. As a result, traditional conservatives reluctantly support capitalism and are prepared for the state to put measures in place, such as tariffs, to protect home producers and stabilize prices and market forces. This is known as protectionism. Traditional conservatives believe strongly in the hereditary right to rule, likewise with ONS conservatives. However, the neoliberals do not, believing in meritocracy. With regard to human nature, both ONS and traditionals believe that without law and order there will be chaos. The neoliberals disagree, as they believe strongly in individualism and freedom with limited state intervention to protect their fundamental human rights. So they're more interested in something like the Wild Wild West, and mostly they want freedom to protect their own property. In regards to the economy is where they are most torn apart. Traditional conservatives like the idea that capitalism creates economic inequality as well as the protection of private property. However, they do not like that its nature is fast-moving and prone to radical change. I believe they distrust radical change because it makes them easily usurpable and overthrowable. One Nation conservatives were more invested in the idea of noblesse oblige and invested into the welfare state, nationalization, and progressive taxation. Neoliberals, however, took a different approach. They deregulated the government to allow more freedom to the individual, allowing lower taxes and privatization. So what Jimmy Carter did when he deregulated the transportation industry was new conservatism. So Jimmy Carter was a neoliberal by his practices. Neoliberals feel less of an obligation to the poor. No noblesse oblige, because they believe that it is poor people's own fault that they are poor. They do not recognize the legitimacy of inherited power, so that somehow seems to excuse them of any obligation to the poor. How can rugged individualists, neoliberals, not traditional conservatives, defend the idea of limitless private ownership, as in the game of Monopoly, without expecting the inevitable conclusion of one person eventually owning everything and everyone? In a finite world, at least, must there not be some sort of mutually agreed upon checks and balances to the magnitude of individual possessions? James M. Buchanan, who we'll get to in a minute, posited that all humans at all times act only out of self-interest. He was, as it turns out, a prime architect of neoliberalism. From what I can tell, he at least felt that his interests would best be served in a game that resembled Monopoly. I fairly recently dedicated 4 episodes of this show to James McGill Buchanan, so go back and watch those if you're interested in this guy. He's a really amazing person. And by amazing, he's a really evil person. With regard to nations, the inevitable conclusion is the same. One nation, particularly its plutocrats, will end up owning everything. Meritocratic thinkers assume they will climb to the top of whatever pile they are part of because they have more merit. Perhaps they are correct. Do they also believe they have more intrinsic value? Do other lives matter as much as theirs do? Dr. Seuss's Sneetches are a fine example. How would they feel if, say, they suddenly suffered from a stroke and their cleverness, aptitude, or good looks left them? Will they agree that life then should suddenly cast them aside? If a wealthy woman is endowed with good looks, should her power vanish if her good looks vanish? Perhaps so in a meritocratic society. The rules of the game have been rigged by people such as Ayn Rand and James McGill Buchanan Jr., economist, not president. There's also a James Buchanan who was a president. So Rand and Buchanan have made it acceptable, encouraged even, to exploit others in the name of progress. The system and its rules is more important than the individuals within the system who serve merely as cogs. The individuals who serve as the engineers and architects and skyscraper builders and such are the priest kings, however, and they are worshipped as gods. They live outside the rules. Rules are for those who become part of the machinery itself. Regular people are human capital stock. I'm quoting Kevin Hassett, White House advisor, who is quoted as saying U.S. workers are human capital stock. A brouhaha ensued. This whole linguistic fracas began on Monday when White House advisor Kevin Hassett appeared for an interview on CNN and tried to explain why he thought the economy was poised to bounce back quickly from the coronavirus crisis. Our human capital stock is ready to get back to work, he declared, sounding a bit like an AI that had yet to learn idiomatic English. So there are lots of reasons to believe that we can get back to work way faster than we have in previous crises. I'm jumping around again. Income inequality is good then, right? Even if it encourages exploitation, right? Because the rising tide lifts all the ships, right? Balderdash! This is being done to most of us without our consent. We sign no release forms before we are born into this type of system. The media are merely the most powerful of many tools that the priest kings use to build and shape this meritocratic society. Instead of Legos, our priest kings use societal building blocks to create their masterworks. They manufacture consent for the rules of the game that allow them to use everyone and everything as raw materials. Crucial to understanding Buchanan's system of thought is the distinction he made between politics and policy. Politics is about the rules of the game, where policy is focused on strategies that players adopt within a given set of rules. Questions about what are good rules of the game are in the domain of social philosophy, whereas questions about the strategies that players will adopt given those rules is the domain of economics. And it is the play between the rules, social philosophy, and the strategies, economics, that constitutes what Buchanan refers to as constitutional political economy. So what happens when most of the cogs in the machinery begin to wake up to what's going on and begin to resent their assigned roles? Personally, I know how the architects of the huge social media platforms feel about people like me. They wish I'd shut the fuck up and stop attempting to encourage the rest of the cogs to become restive. They actively seek to reduce my influence within their sandbox of unwitting humanity. They use algorithms to elevate authoritative voices and to quell the little guys who might otherwise grow too big for their britches. They currently have a monopoly on propaganda and misinformation, and they want to keep it that way. They work actively against independent operators who seek to help the masses resist their nefarious schemes. They do this on behalf of the priest kings. And why do we need skyscrapers and huge cities? Why do we need to be efficient and maximize growth and profits? These are honest questions. Why do we need cell phones and other gadgets? And if we do collectively agree that these innovations are worthwhile, and I'm not sure I'd agree to that, shouldn't we be able to democratically determine if we are willing to sacrifice our physical and emotional well-being for the sake of achieving and maintaining these innovations? Nobody's ever asked me about this. The architects of society have worked very hard to subvert the will of the masses when it comes to answering questions such as these. True democracy is the last thing our owners want. They say that their belief is that we don't know what's good for us, but the truth is we aren't willing to agree to what our owners decide is good for us because we know that they don't give an actual shit about us. James M. Buchanan would probably admit as much were he still among us. May he rest in whatever the opposite of peace is. Buchanan maintains that a person's first instinct is to make their decisions based upon their own self-interest, which varied from previous models where government officials acted in constituents' best interest. Buchanan explains public choice theory as politics without romance, because he says many of the promises made in politics are intended to appear concerned with the interest of others, but in reality are the products of selfish ulterior motives. According to this view, political decisions on both sides of the voting booth are rarely made with the intention of helping anyone but the one making the decision. Buchanan argues that by analyzing the behaviors of voters and politicians, that their actions could become easily predicted. And by extension, their actions can be easily manipulated. By his own laws of human nature, it would be tough for him to deny that anything but self-interest motivates neoliberals, which is why it is here concluded, I finally got around to the punchline, that George Floyd was killed by neoliberalism. The entitlement of our corporate masters is carried out by their paid enforcers of the rules of the game that they have engineered is what makes it possible to remove the cogs who cause too much trouble, who are otherwise unwilling to play by the rules that have been imposed. And these rules have not been imposed by democracy. Law enforcement officers have internalized these implicit values. They know through enculturation who the favored and disfavored ones are. Someone like George Floyd is considered by the owners of society to be a drag on the system. Such a person is perceived by anyone who has internalized our current neoliberal societal values to be a threat and thus expendable. But law enforcement officers are merely tools. It is the disdain of the architects themselves that truly ended George Floyd. As an aside, military personnel also are tools of the same masters, but they inflict their masters' economic wishes on the world stage rather than in cities like Minneapolis. The National Guard is an exception. I don't know about you, but if I were a member of the National Guard, I would feel pretty shitty about quelling riots like this. Yes, all 4 officers should face the death penalty. But the most powerful disdain for people like George Floyd comes from much higher up. The owners of society and the chief architects, such as the most powerful DNC insiders, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Tom Perez, Barack Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton. These are the most deserving of extinction. It is their knees that rest on all of our necks, and it is for that reason that mass demonstrations and riots are appropriate. The property damage and looting are especially appropriate because when insurance companies lose money, our owners are directly impacted, even though they inflict their suffering on all of us collectively in the form of higher insurance rates and even get us to blame each other for it. We need to name names. We need to hold individuals and other entities accountable. Corporate politicians, judges, and pundits absolutely need to be held accountable. But even more culpable are those who pay them. There is always a money trail. We have a garden that should be named democracy. As of now, it is more appropriately named oligarchy. The potential grain and fruit of democracy must flourish unencumbered by parasitical weeds. We especially need to pull out neoliberalism by its roots. We know the names and residences of these roots, and work diligently to maintain democracy in a healthier condition going forward. In these difficult times, some cuts may be necessary. Chunk.